midst of an exciting and frightening new era. After decades of secrecy, the U.S. government and military have finally acknowledged the likelihood that extraterrestrial vehicles are visiting our planet. Most often, these crafts are witnessed at a safe distance, far away in the skies above. But what happens when someone encounters a UFO close up? One that's actually landed here on Earth.
This is a close encounter of the third kind, just like in the movie.
To come into physical contact with something from another world is life-altering.
And potentially life-threatening.
They can be potentially very dangerous. Yes, indeed.
There's many people who've come forward with very physical markings on their bodies and had very traumatic bodily imprints from their experiences.
What is going on here? Why they're here on this planet?
Kaz Clark has been searching for the answer since 2016, when the Welsh resident came face to face with a UFO.
What I saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. I was completely challenged on everything I thought I knew and believed.
It all started in 2016 in Kaz's hometown of Penturk, Wales.
Penturk is beautiful. It's a tiny little village at the top of a mountain where you can see in every direction. You've got these ebbing fields that roll away from you for miles.
But over a 3-night period in February, Kaz is awoken by an unusual sound.
It was quite loud, and I'd noticed this plane just flying very low and very slow over my village in a figure-8 pattern. And a bit later, a second plane turned up to take its place, almost identical to the first plane, and that would continue the same flight pattern, and the first one would leave, and then later it would come back and they'd swap again. And this went on all night.
Disturbing not just Kaz, but the entire neighborhood.
I can imagine for the people living in this small little village in Wales, suddenly having military aircraft show up out of nowhere would be quite startling.
People were wondering what's going on here.
For years, Penturk residents have become accustomed to noisy planes passing overhead.
We have an RAF base about 14 miles away from us. So occasionally we get military aircraft that fly over, but we don't actually get any that stay. And we had 2 aircraft that stayed for 3 days and 3 nights.
But it's not the oddest aerial event locals have experienced. This region of Wales is also known for its frequent sightings of aircraft that are completely silent.
This is an area that is definitely known as a UFO hotspot. There's a large number of sightings for a very long period of time. And in fact, the activity is strong enough that it's been called the Welsh Triangle.
And even more interesting, its most famous case involved an actual UFO landing.
On February 4th, 1977, a group of students from the Broadhaven Primary School in Wales witnessed a strange object land near their playground.
It's an astonishing case.
That garnered a flurry of media attention nationwide.
The spaceship, it looked a cigar shape with a dome on it. And it had a yellowy, orange to red light on top of it.
The drawings that the children produced were very similar. It really says that something might have occurred.
Their pictures emerged as the most eerie and creepiest things out of this case.
But many, including the military, suspected it was just the children's imagination, or perhaps they misperceived an ordinary aircraft or helicopter.
It's really not surprising.
It's actually quite common for military officials to obfuscate and otherwise hide from public view some of what's going on.
It's something Kaz would encounter when she inquires if the planes circling over Penturk are a part of a military exercise she isn't aware of. But she receives no response.
There are classified projects, perhaps there are maneuvers that are very, very sensitive.
But on the evening of February 26th, Kaz witnesses the shocking reason why the military planes are circling overhead.
I decided that if these planes were still there, I would come out and watch them. And I heard what I thought was a missile coming. It was very loud.
Kaz turns to see what appears to be an E-3 Sentry, a large military aircraft used primarily for surveillance, and it's coming in fast.
she didn't really know what to think about this because it was so outside her normal experience. It's reasonable to wonder, like, what is going on here?
It certainly wasn't ordinary.
Just how extraordinary, Kaz will soon discover.
I remember it like it happened yesterday. The E3 sentry started to circle, and then this bright red light became visible high above the trees behind my house. I never expected to see anything like this. I had run to get an unobstructed view, and this one red light turned into 3 red lights.
Finally forming what Kaz describes as a large pyramid-shaped craft.
I was in awe of what I was seeing. This thing was enormous.
When you see a real, silent, massive triangle, it cannot be compared to anything else. For the witnesses, a lot of them think they're actually losing their minds.
It was the most spooky thing I've ever seen in my life. This thing didn't come down from outer space. This thing emerged through the space, like it came through a veil into our world.
Kaz knows this is no terrestrial aircraft.
This was no way man-made. There was no sound, no downdraft, no nothing.
Kaz needs to get evidence of what she is witnessing.
I've reached for my phone and it won't even switch on. It's completely dead.
Electrical effects have been often reported by encounters with UFOs. People will say that they've tried to get photographs or recordings, and yet they were unable to. There have been stories of cars that had their electrical systems fail completely when in fact they've been operating normally up until then.
And Kaz Clark's unworldly experience is about to get stranger still. The large pyramid craft appears to be landing.
The pyramid was turning very slowly anti-clockwise, and as it approached the ground, it ejected like a hand of lightning. That's the only way I can describe it. It's thick, like fire, like fingers.
Kaz then hears more military aircraft approaching and realizes this is what they are searching for.
The military knew it was coming. They were definitely prepared. They were waiting and watching for this thing.
When you really stop and think about it, it's astonishing.
Especially in what Kaz sees happen next.
These objects come out the top of the pyramid, and I didn't see any of those because I was so fixated on it touching the ground. These 2 barrel-shaped objects approached from across the field, and one of them stopped at about 20 feet off the ground and about 20 to 30 feet away, and I just stared at it. And then I felt it scan me and stood in shock. I was so afraid for my safety.
Eyewitnessing a UFO forever changes the way we look at our skies. When these phenomena make actual physical contact on Earth, it can be a much more frightening experience.
What people have seen is so shocking. In many of these cases, someone actually physically touches the craft. And the fact is, these things are incredibly dangerous.
Individuals suffer trauma to the point where they can suffer PTSD the rest of their lives.
Kaz Clark's frightening encounter produced some unexpected after effects.
It turned my hair white overnight. Completely white, which is a little bit of a shock in the morning.
Which sounds crazy, but this is a detail that does turn up in other cases. People who get too close to a UFO will actually experience a change in their hair color.
Kaz contacts the Department of Defense to see if she could obtain any information about what she witnessed. Their response is shocking.
They said that they were doing a military exercise. No, I can categorically assure you this was no exercise. This was a real event.
Kaz makes it her mission to uncover the truth.
I wanted to check out the landing site. I wanted to see if there were burn marks on the ground, to see if there was any physical evidence of this thing, this pyramid craft.
Kaz's home video shows the shocking evidence she and her neighbors found.
Like phosphorus, isn't it? That's what that's white. Something's burnt that tree up there. I don't know if we can get there and get a sample of that. That would be good.
We'd gone over to what I call the near landing field, where this hand of lightning had come out of this craft. Everything was dead. Everything was dead. All the grass, the gorse bushes were all dead. like something had sucked all of the life out of them. There were 60-foot trees snapped mid-trunk,
See the scuffs on the trees?
12 to 14 inches thick,
Yeah, and this one here, the skinny one, again.
and burn marks on the surrounding trees.
At least you can see the discolor in there.
This was strong physical evidence.
I mean, there are broken trees.
To be certain, Kaz has the landing site tested for radiation.
They tested the ground with a Geiger counter, and it detected radiation. And the radiation there was so high, it was the equivalent of being X-rayed for 2 hours constantly. And people were made ill from being there. The whole team suffered from headaches to nausea, burning skin, burning eyes, just from being in that field for less than an hour.
When a UFO lands, when it actually touches down, often it will leave types of radiation. This can be very dangerous.
One of the most famous cases of a serious injury caused by a UFO happened back in 1967 in Manitoba, Canada.
Which has become known as the Falcon Lake incident. It's certainly one of the most popular and better documented cases in Canada, even with the Canadian Mint releasing a special edition coin for collectors that depicts the Falcon Lake incident on it.
It really has everything you could ever want in a UFO story.
The alleged victim of this notorious UFO encounter, Stefan Mahalik, barely escaped with his life. And his chilling story is something his son, Stan, will never forget.
I can tell you that as a 10-year-old, I was afraid. But I believed him. I believed every word that came out of his mouth.
It all started in May 1967, when Stefan, an amateur geologist, hikes up to a remote wooded location known for its precious stones and gems, Falcon Lake.
For him, it was a rock hound's dream. It was a lovely day. The weather was beautiful, the skies are blue. He hiked probably for 4 or 5 hours until he found what he thought was a promising area of rock. So by mid-morning, he was already at work. He's got his goggles on, he's got his gloves on, he's got his rock pick, and he's busy banging away at a vein of quartz. He was in his element.
But the tranquility will soon turn to terror.
He looks up, there are 2 shapes in the sky, and his first thought as he sees them is, typical dad, what the hell is that? They're saucer-shaped, sort of like taking 2 milk bowls and putting one on top of the other. They are glowing, and they are almost dead silent.
Stefan is startled when one of the saucer-shaped crafts breaks off and heads towards him.
He's at one end of this rocky outcrop, and this craft landed on the flattest part of the giant granite rocky outcrop that he was working on. And within a few seconds, the one that was hovering above departs.
Leaving Stefan alone, only a few meters away from what appears to be a flying saucer.
Looking at the craft that landed, we've got a circular shape that's about 30 to 40 feet in diameter. The top has a dome, a smaller bowl, if you will, over top of the bigger bowl, and there are slits all around it, and this thing is making him squint because he can't look at it directly. It's extremely bright.
And he realized that this certainly was no kind of aircraft from this planet.
My heart goes out to people who come upon a landed UFO, because this has got to be an unnerving experience. This is not a distant light in the sky. This is something that's right there in front of you. It can be so scary, people will pass out.
But not Stefan. He faced many fearful situations years before in Poland. He was a covert operative during World War II.
This speaks to his character. Because of his life experiences, he recognized that don't get afraid until there's a reason to be. It hasn't harmed me.
Remembering his training, the war veteran focuses on chronicling details of the strange craft in front of him.
He sits back and he pulls out a sketch pad and begins drawing it out.
He noted that it had a dome and it had some bright lights around the top. He noted that a door had opened in one side and that there was an exhaust vent off to the side of the door. He described a classic Hollywood-style flying saucer.
It's then Stefan notices something startling.
A portal on the craft has opened. It was a series of sliding panels, like a camera shutter, to reveal the door.
Stefan's fear is outweighed by his intense curiosity. He musters up the courage to take a closer look.
When he walked towards this craft, he was able to describe it in more detail.
And he sees there are no seams, there are no rivets, there are no screws, there's nothing.
This is beyond the ordinary.
Stefan approaches the door and cautiously peers inside the craft.
He recognized that there were walls about 18 or so inches, so that's a pretty thick wall. And he noticed that there was a lot of light, and he reaches out with his gloved hand to touch the craft. But when he touches it, the skin of the craft is so hot that the rubber tips of all of the fingers of his glove are melted immediately.
That, I would say, is probably a regular feature of anyone who gets within a couple of feet of a UFO. They are often very hot. They will burn you.
Stefan is about to discover this firsthand.
A blast came out of this object, knocking him to the ground, setting his clothes on fire,
injuring him severely.
He's afraid that he's going to die.
They are not just seen in the sky. UFOs have also come down to our planet, petrifying those who encountered them.
This can be the most traumatic experience of their life.
Especially if you get too close.
So you have to be very careful.
Stan Mihalik's father, Stefan, found out just how dangerous they really are. In 1967, the amateur geologist claims he was severely injured by a flying saucer in the wilds of Manitoba, Canada.
He was burned to the upper part of his chest.
There have been cases of burns as a result of being close to these things.
To make matters worse, after the UFO blasts off, Stefan Mihalik is now physically ill.
He was head spinning, he's dizzy, he's vomiting.
Stefan has little choice but to attempt the long hike through the rough terrain.
So, picks up whatever little stuff he's got there, but leaves a lot of it behind, and begins to stumble to the highway.
Miraculously, Stefan manages to make the long journey.
He was eventually treated and examined at a hospital. The burns on his body were very, very evident.
The most dramatic part of the case is the photographs of the burns themselves.
They were as if you had taken a checkerboard and put a red checker on each of the squares and then took away the board itself.
Which is extremely puzzling to his doctors.
They didn't really know what to think about this because it was so outside their normal experience.
I can only imagine how Stefan's son Stan must have felt when he saw the state his father was in.
He would get his chance when his father eventually comes home.
My dad had never looked like this to me. He had never been out of control or hurt or sick in my memory. So to see him like that was frightening. The burns were pretty bad.
Stefan finally confesses what caused it. He was burned by a flying saucer.
Stefan Mihalik said that if you don't believe me, don't believe me.
I believed him. My father would not lie to me.
The RCMP, Canada's federal law enforcement agency, interviews Stefan about his wild claims. They quickly realize he is not making the story up and ask him to take them to where the alleged incident took place.
What was found at Falcon Lake was very, very significant.
Stefan shows them his melted gloves, burnt shirt, and they discover something even stranger in the surrounding environment.
That entire ring of trees that surround the spot where the craft came down and landed, all the leaves were withered and brown.
And more compelling, what their Geiger counter reveals.
They would check for radiation and realize, oh my goodness, this spot is radioactive. And it seemed to be stronger at the very center of where the craft sat. And the RCMP acknowledged that yes, This is a legitimate scene where something occurred that resulted in the injury to this man.
Charles Chuck Halt, a retired U.S. Air Force officer, put forward some of the most compelling evidence ever of a UFO landing, an audio recording, now famously known as the Halt tapes.
The reason why this case is so compelling is because of these tapes.
I had a recorder, just a small microcassette. I didn't take it thinking I was going to make a tape of a UFO incident. I was frightened to death.
And he has seen a lot over his long career. At the time of the incident, Colonel Halt was the deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters in the UK, located near the now infamous Rendlesham Forest.
The Rendlesham case is genuinely one of the most interesting UFO cases. That's often called Britain's Roswell, and it's understandable why.
The frightening event occurred over a 2-night period.
In late December of 1980, RAF Bentwaters experienced a strange surge of UFO activity. 2 security patrol men from RAF Bentwaters left the base and headed into Rendlesham Forest because there was claims of some sort of strange object that had descended into the forest, and they were following these bright lights when they basically bumped into a strange craft parked on the ground in the middle of the forest. They approached it, and as they got closer, all of a sudden, it lifted off from the ground and it took off into the sky.
Deputy Commander Colonel Halt was briefed about the alleged UFO landing in the forest near Bentwaters.
I didn't believe it, to be very honest with you.
Of course, people are going to be skeptical when they hear a story about this.
But Colonel Halt would become a true believer the very next night.
The on-duty flight lieutenant came in, and he was white as a sheet. And he said, "It's back." I said, "What's back?" He said, "The UFO is back. We saw something in the woods. It had multicolored lights. There's something out there."
Micro recorder in hand, Halt and a few of the base's security officers head out to investigate.
You get to hear firsthand Colonel Halt talking about things he's seeing in front of him. There's moments where he is totally flabbergasted by what he's seeing.
Halt and his team first investigate the alleged landing location witnessed the night before.
150 feet or more from the initial, I should say, suspected impact point.
They make an alarming discovery. Physical evidence that the servicemen are telling the truth. 3 deep impressions in the ground.
The indentations in the ground were approximately 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And when we looked overhead, we could definitely see a break in the canopy, and we saw broken branches on the ground.
This is great evidence. This shows that physically something was actually there. UFO landings will sometimes leave high levels of radiation.
We had the Geiger counter.
For getting a heat spot on a tree.
The readings we got were 8 or 9 times normal background radiation.
It's then the craft spotted the night before makes a return appearance.
You just saw a light where? Hey, I see it too. What is it? We don't know, sir.
We see this glowing orange-like object, almost like a small sun. It's oval-shaped.
There's no doubt about it. There's some type of strange flashing red light ahead. There's definitely something. We're probably about 200 to 300 yards away, and it's still moving from side to side. Hey, this is eerie. This is strange.
Halt and his team pursue the strange light, and something extraordinary happens.
We stop at the edge of the field, and we're watching it, and suddenly it silently explodes into 5 objects with multicolored lights.
Now we have multiple sightings of up to 5 lights with a similar shape, some kind of phenomenon. This is weird.
One of the more unusual things about this particular case is the observation of this object apparently splitting into multiple objects at once. That you don't come across quite as frequently.
Or what Halt and his team experience next.
Now we've got an object about 10 degrees directly south. He's coming toward us.
Which is a lot scarier.
It's coming this way. It is definitely coming this way.
You can hear Colonel Halt's stress level rise on the tape.
What Halt sees will chill him to the bone.
Stops above us and sends down the equivalent, I would say today, a laser beam.
Now we're observing what appears appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal.
We're standing there in awe, thinking, is this a weapon?
Frozen in fear, under a UFO, Colonel Halt's world would forever be altered.
It was kind of a shock. Nobody's ever going to believe this.
Except he has the tape. Witnessing a UFO touchdown on Earth is a frightening experience, something you will never forget.
It's one thing to see a UFO flying in the sky. It's quite another to come upon a landed UFO. This has got to be a pretty traumatic experience.
My father never came to terms with what he saw. He never really quite was the same person he was prior.
I didn't believe in UFOs. When you've eliminated everything else, however improbable, whatever remains must be the truth.
I'm definitely a believer that we are not alone.
But each of their encounters were different. The unworldly crafts they saw varied in shape and in size.
What Mihalik saw is a classic UFO. It's this disc shaped like two pie plates, you know, on one side or another. To me, that's a classic UFO.
And Kaz's large pyramid.
Large objects in the shape of a pyramid have been reported by UFO witnesses for many decades.
Luminous barrels or balls of light, splitting apart or ejecting off a larger craft.
There are many cases where often a ball of light or some other object drops out or is expelled from a main craft, may split into other parts and then return to the craft.
Many ufologists suspect this could be the extraterrestrials' mothership.
One of the great memes in ufology is the mothership, a very large craft that was probably what brought all the smaller UFOs and then discharged them to fly around Earth. This mothership has occasionally been seen.
And incredibly, one of them may have been recently spotted traveling near our planet.
Oumuamua was a large object detected entering our solar system somewhere around October 2017. And the reason why Oumuamua made headlines was because of its strange shape.
And its strange behavior. At first, astronomers thought the large object was just an oddly shaped meteor, asteroid, or even a comet. But its unpredictable movements baffled scientists.
There were these odd moments where Oumuamua would slow down in speed and then suddenly pick up its speed and accelerate. So it wasn't maintaining a consistent speed, but it seemed to slow down and speed up at will.
In 2018, an astonishing hypothesis was put forward by a renowned Harvard astrophysicist. Oumuamua may have been sent here by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization.
Avi Loeb basically said that Oumuamua was some sort of alien spaceship or alien craft that was passing through our solar system. We need to be open to the possibility that it might be.
But is there any proof these celestial crafts have come down here to our planet?
With these kinds of alleged visitations, there might be ground traces left behind that leave marks.
Chuck, Stan, and Kaz claim they found some.
There were 6 huge trees that had been snapped 20 feet in the air, with all scrape marks and burn marks on the surrounding trees.
It's pretty clear something huge came down. This was not a little object. The Rendlesham incident left actual indentations in the soil. It left actual radiation readings, which were detected with a Geiger counter.
Some people had gone back and looked at that instrument and said, well, with the readings you were getting were 8 or 9 times normal background radiation.
These high levels of radiation may have caused the environmental damage found at each of the landing sites.
This is fairly common within the UFO narrative. I know there were investigations done after the alleged abduction of Travis Walton in the 1970s, where the trees had experienced some sort of change in chemistry as well as growth patterns.
This might explain the bizarre abnormalities that both Kaz and Stefan experienced after their encounters.
Physiological reactions are relatively rare, particularly with sightings. But when it comes to landed UFOs, this is much more common. Kaz Clark had physiological effects. It turned her hair white.
There are definite physical effects on human bodies in close proximity to these objects. They do emit some kind of field, some kind of radiation, something that affects us physically. There's a really interesting case back in December 1980 in Texas. 2 women and the grandson of one of them all suffered radiation burns from this object.
Just like Stan's father. But the most serious injuries that Stefan suffered appeared to be the result of the UFO's unusual propulsion system.
A blast came out of a grill or a vent that was on the side of this object, hitting him in the chest and stomach, knocking him to the ground, setting his clothes on fire.
And he was quite ill for quite some time.
It's clear that the immense technological power these craft possess is far beyond our own and potentially very dangerous.
These objects are operating according to other principles of propulsion that we don't understand.
There's a theory that these craft are using some sort of electromagnetic field propulsion.
This could explain the extraordinary feats that Kaz, Chuck, and Stefan observed, seemingly breaking the known laws of physics.
These are very advanced craft. They can outdistance our fastest craft. They are largely untouchable.
More shocking, these unearthly objects appear to have the ability to shut down any of our technologies at will.
Kaz Clark said that her phone got drained of its battery charge like almost immediately.
They have the ability to do this. They can affect electromagnetic instruments of all kinds. They can shut down car engines. They can turn off lights. This is something we see fairly consistently.
But these theories offer little comfort to those who've confronted advanced and possibly extraterrestrial craft.
It's one of those unresolved things that I'll probably never have an answer to.
I believe my father. Something happened to him.
It challenged everything I thought I knew and believed. Because for all our lives, we've been told these things aren't real. We are alone. We're not alone.
And they suspect our world governments and militaries are keeping them in the dark about what they really know.
Our government and governments across the world will go to great lengths to cover up UFO evidence.
When the military came out to see me and threatened my kids, that's when it changed for me.
What would you do if you got so close to a UFO that you could actually reach out and touch it? Would you feel fear? Excitement? Would anyone believe you?
That's a big claim to make, an extraterrestrial craft landing on Earth.
But with more and more of these harrowing stories now coming forward, they are becoming harder to discredit, compelling us to acknowledge that extraterrestrial crafts are here and have been on Earth.
It seems like every other day some new startling piece of information comes out that never would have seen the light of day before.
The invention of social media itself has really altered the landscape via people's posts, via their videos, via everything they're sharing.
Stan affirms there is photographic evidence of his father's injuries and his sketch of the UFO.
It's a beautiful drawing. He actually got to touch the craft and, of course, paid a price with his health.
Kaz has video as proof of her frightening encounter.
I think the best explanation we have is that there was an extraterrestrial craft of some kind which came down and actually knocked trees down in the forest.
And one of the most interesting things for me about Rendlesham, we have an audio recording.
Hey, this is Erie.
What we saw in the forest was definitely not man-made.
Despite the chilling testimony and physical evidence that Chuck, Kaz, and Stan provided, their stories were largely ignored or outright rejected by investigators.
The RCMP acknowledged that yes, something occurred that resulted in the injury to this man. We just don't know what it was. Even the government of the day came to the same non-conclusion.
Surprisingly, even Chuck Hult's audio recording didn't convince his superior officers to take action.
I played the tape, and the general looked at the staff and said, well, what do we do? Nobody said anything. So the general, in his infinite wisdom, said, well, it happened off the base. It's a British affair. Case closed.
Kaz had a similar experience with the British Air Force when she and other witnesses reported that they saw military aircraft engage the UFO. Their response was outright denial that it even happened.
I don't think the military want to disclose what happened that night because these things aren't supposed to be real.
It's a theory backed by many. Our world's militaries and governments have been keeping the public in the dark about what they really know about UFOs.
There's a deliberate cover-up of UFO events.
Governments don't like to give up secrets, and if they uncovered the fact that these were extraterrestrials or some sort of phenomena they could not control, that doesn't look good for a government who's trying to say we are in control when they're not.
The best way you can convey something like that is to make it ridiculous.
It's something Chuck experienced firsthand.
After the event, the 4-star commander of Air Force was given a copy of my memo and a copy of my tape, and they put out enough disinformation to make it seem, it wasn't credible.
Kaz found out that authorities will go to even more frightening lengths to keep witnesses quiet.
Strange things started happening to my phones and my laptop computer. All my emails, my messages in chat boxes were all deleted. But when the military came out to see me and threatened my kids, that's when it changed for me. I was physically shaking, and I didn't speak to anybody about it for a full 18 months afterwards. I still think I do have post-traumatic stress.
To receive threats from elements within your own government, that has got to be very frightening. That has got to be extremely disconcerting. This means to me that something happened that the government does not want people to know about.
But ufologists wonder what kind of secret is so important that people's lives are being threatened in order to keep it.
The common thread between these three stories is that there seems to be a military connection. Such was the case in Rendlesham, that was the case with Kaz Clark.
And Falcon Lake is only a few kilometers from a military base in Winnipeg.
There are many cases where UFOs have been attracted to military bases.
Particularly military bases with nuclear capabilities. That is something that seems to be of particular interest.
UFOs have been seen over nuclear installations for a long time, as far back as the 1940s when we first developed nuclear science and technology.
They seem to be very interested in our technology.
It's a frightening prospect to consider. These celestial crafts may pose a threat to our military and nuclear facilities.
I think if there is a threat, we should be told. It's of the utmost importance for everybody on this planet.
Considering there is evidence that the general public may be in danger too.
What I found shocking was the amount of people hurt, accompanied by some very serious physical problems.
This has Stan Mahalik wondering, did the UFO that his father encountered over 50 years ago intend to injure or even kill him?
The answer isn't easy. Maybe they're dangerous. Maybe they're not so friendly, but we got no proof of that.
Whatever their intentions, it's clear people who witness a UFO close-up carry the encounter forever.
This experience has changed my entire life. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed.
I believe my father's story, and I'll continue to believe the possibility that it's something beyond.
I can tell you, we're not alone. There is another life form that we don't understand or don't know.
I think the most important connecting feature of government action is to avoid panic.
But should we be afraid? There is a new belief that these extraterrestrial beings are actually not here to harm us, but possibly to save us. Sightings of unidentified flying objects have increased substantially over the past decade, and there is compelling evidence that it's been happening for a very long time.
There's no denying this is not something that just started happening. This physical contact has been going on
including UFO landings.
This is something that we know has been occurring for centuries, but I don't think there's any really good evidence that these things are hostile. If they are truly as advanced as they seem to be, they could take over in an hour, in a day.
Surprisingly, it's an opinion shared by Stan, Kaz, and Chuck.
I don't know what they were trying to do. The one that especially came over obviously was aware we were there. Whatever it was, it didn't do anything except frighten us.
I didn't fear them, and they didn't seem to be hostile in any shape or form. Like I felt elated, and almost it was like I'd been touched by something. That's the only way I can describe it.
My dad was curious, yes, wonder, yes, but not afraid.
And his injuries may have been a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
This appears to be accidental, perhaps. I don't think the UFOs are doing this on purpose. If that were true, we would already have the War of the Worlds, and that's not what we're seeing. So I think it's pretty clear that these guys, these mysterious visitors, are here coming in peace, coming with just sort of a message of hello, you're not alone in this universe. They're not here on militaristic missions trying to take over.
But perhaps instead to watch over us.
We have what are called contactees who proclaim that aliens are trying to help us, warning us of what we're doing to our planet and that we need to prioritize our environment, that we need to take care of our Earth and the possibility that we could actually end all of humanity with the press of a button. There are benevolent saviors that are trying to rescue us from our impending doom,
including other celestial threats, like what occurred over the Ural region of Russia.
As an astronomer, I'm fascinated with the story of Chelyabinsk.
This is a very interesting incident which occurred on February 15th, 2013. It was a huge, huge event. A meteor came crashing down over Ural, Russia, in the Chelyabinsk area. This was coming in fast and hard.
And potentially catastrophic if it struck the Earth. Incredibly, eyewitness videos captured a potential reason why it never did.
What's very, very interesting about this is the footage shows what looks like an object coming from behind and coming up through this meteor and breaking it into pieces. Something came and hit this meteor. This, many people have speculated, was a UFO. That might sound strange to the average person. What, a UFO coming to break up a meteor? This is something our UFO visitors do. This is something that they do regularly. They are watching for any meteors that might come and actually hit the Earth and cause a huge loss of life. They are our protectors. They are our guardians.
And just may come down to visit us from time to time.
I think we should be very open to the possibility that aliens are out there somewhere.
This was something way beyond anything that I understood. It just still puzzles me.
This is an entirely new planet since my dad's story in 1967. I think if he stepped forward today and said, this is what happened to me, there would have been an entirely different reaction than back then.